We've all heard of the many myths coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, in particular the Aegean Sea, over the course of many years. These myths and tales have sparked many a fascination and inspired many a person to go to this part of the world in order to find their own discoveries. In particular, circa 1900 CE, an English archaeologist by the name of Sir Arthur Evans, perhaps inspired by these myths indeed, ventured to the Isle of Crete and discovered a palace known as Knossos that until that point had thought only to be the subject of myth entirely. The myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you lads and ladies around the world, and welcome back to our series on Bronze Age Greece. Last time we began our series with the Cyclades culture, perhaps the first civilization in the Aegean Sea and the area today we now know as Greece and Anatolia, of course of which is now Turkey. As stated in the previous episode, the Cyclades culture was not conquered nor assimilated, but was instead eclipsed by a nearby flourishing culture known as the Minoans, based mainly on the Isle of Crete. And as previously stated, a key point of differentiation between the Cyclades and the Minoans is that while the Cyclades were settled more around villages and small towns, the Minoan civilization depended largely on what is known as palace settlements. Now, these palace settlements essentially functioned as small-scale cities, quite possibly emulations of other city-states in the Near and Middle East, such as those in Sumeria, Palestine, and perhaps on the mainland in Anatolia. And these palace settlements were similar to their contemporaries at the time, because in their centre sat a large multi-room complex, the palace, which is perhaps a Minoan touch on the city system used in Mesopotamia at the time, where of course in Mesopotamia you'd have the ziggurat or grand temple centred in the middle of a city. In Minoan culture on the other hand, you had the palace, where the local chief or king would rule over their populace. And if you've had the good fortune to look at a map of Crete lately, you'll see that the island itself is not terribly big. So of course these city-states, I suppose you could call them, were not very huge either, with each king having rulership over a population of roughly a few thousand. But of course there were multiple city-states like these across the island itself, most notably among them being Knossos, Phaistos, Mallia and Zakro. And you're probably thinking, city-states this early in history? Yes, that much is true. For example, in the classical era of Greece, which would follow Bronze Age Greece by a few more centuries, the Greeks were not a united people. Instead, each lived and were ruled by certain city-states, which differentiated in their governance and way of life. Just look at the differentiation between Athens and Sparta in the classical era of Greece. And as for city-states, of course, we have them in the modern world today. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of a city-state is that of Singapore in Southeast Asia. And speaking of the economic powerhouse that is Singapore, let's move on to the economies of these palace settlements. Now, the economies of these palace settlements were based mainly around the collection, storage and redistribution of commodities such as foodstuffs, including grain and olive oil in particular, much like a modern taxation system today, when of course it's not affected by corruption. Anyway, this system of taxation applied to the lands that these palace centres controlled, meaning that commodities such as food and other resources were collected in specific quantities from private lands, private farms, and also the lower classes of these palace societies. These commodities were then collected in a central system in the palace itself, and redistributed as rations and wages to the local populace. Of course, the palace would take a share of this, and any surplus would be sold off to other powers nearby as trade items. And these trade items did not necessarily consist entirely of just grain and olive oil. As previously stated, this area of the world in ancient times was famed and renowned for its pottery ware, namely such vessels such as amphoras and other ceramics, and of course in terms of trade, that wonder metal of the time, bronze, comes into play, with the Minoans seemingly being masters at working this metal, with items such as daggers, artistic works, and once again, vessels used for storage and drinking were exported from the Minoan territories across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, with Minoan artifacts even finding their way as far away as Mesopotamia, modern-day Syria and Iraq. And of course, these destinations may not seem far-flung from Greece, but imagine yourself as a trader at the time. Of course, you don't even know what the hell a plane, train, bus or car is, so the only reliable methods of transportation were either carting or walking it to your desired destination, or jumping on a ship or boat if you had access to such transport methods. And these traders among the Minoans were so famed that Minoan artifacts have even been found at some Egyptian sites. And of course, in turn, the cartouche of a particular pharaoh has been found at Minoan sites on the Isle of Crete, meaning that the Minoans, although small compared to some of their other contemporary powers at the time, were indeed famed for their craftsmanship and produce, as evidenced by these trade routes taking Minoan traders to far-flung places such as the city-states of Sumeria in Mesopotamia and also the Kingdom of Egypt. And speaking of trade, this particular industry could make a Minoan trader or businessman particularly wealthy indeed, because of course with exportation of goods comes the opposite, importation. And luxury items such as precious metals including gold and silver, as well as jewels, have been thought to have been worn by the upper classes and the wealthy within Minoan society. And speaking of showing off the wealth you have in a futile attempt to impress people, let's move on to explore the social divide between the peoples in Minoan society. Of course, at the poorer end of the spectrum, you had the farmers, the peasantry, and on a similar level to them, you had the craft workers, those who made the famous ceramics and also worked bronze into works of art and other useful tools. These peoples would generally live far away from the palace centres themselves, in small villages made of round mud brick houses that were all clustered together. And despite the apparent divide between the upper echelons of society and those who worked in the fields and in the craft works, it appears from archaeological signs that rebellion or anything like that was rare if non-existent. This may have been in part to the fact that the upper echelons of society, chiefly among them priests and the king or tribal chief, were viewed as an important religious symbol, part of a network which placed the king and any priests as important figures, specifically as intermediaries between the gods and the mortal world. Similar then to the societal view of the ancient Egyptians, whereby the pharaoh was also seen as a sort of god among men, or the physical form of a god or deity on earth among us mere mortals. But despite the apparent gap in wealth between these two groups, the peasantry of Minoan society did not necessarily go it alone in terms of benefits. These peoples benefited from the protection offered by their rulers, in the form of relief from famine when the stores of the palace would be opened to all in society, and also protection from outside forces such as other city-states on the Isle of Crete, or the occasional raiders from the sea. And speaking of the sea, we once again return to trade, and the influence that the Minoans had on the societies around them. For despite their apparent wealth and power, the Minoans, it appears, were not empire builders. Instead, the Minoans were powerful in their cultural influence, much like the impact they had on the Cyclades culture, whereby their culture and way of life merely peacefully eclipsed that of the Cyclades, with the Cyclades peoples copying and imitating the way of life, cultural habits, and perhaps the governmental structures of the Minoans on Crete, with Minoan influence spreading as far east as the coasts of Anatolia and the islands around it, as far west perhaps as the furthest southern points on the Italian peninsula, and even as far into inland Greece as where Athens sits on the Attic Peninsula today. Unfortunately, however, like the Cyclades, this power and dominance enjoyed by the Minoans would be undone eventually. So join us next time as we discuss the fall of the Minoan civilization, and also how a certain overly touristed destination in the Aegean Sea got its geographical shape as we know it today. So if you enjoyed this video, perhaps consider leaving a like and maybe subscribe so that then you don't miss out on any more updates concerning the history of our world and its cultures as part of the Grand Portfolio. For now though, I'm Lewis of the Grand Portfolio, and thank you for watching.